Good morning, Seacrest Village, and hi there. It's Rabbi Leah, and I'm coming to you this Tuesday morning with a heavy heart. We have all been watching what is going on in our country, and it is disturbing and distressing from so many perspectives. And I think if anybody knows in any kind of a clear way how they are feeling about what's going on, perhaps you haven't thought it through completely. I've spoken with so many people over the last several days, and emotions are at a peak. People are upset. This murder last week of this gentleman, George Floyd, at the hands, or I should say at the foot, of a white police officer is just a horrific occurrence. And how we could possibly be so naive as to believe that we wouldn't see some sort of repercussions astounds me. So I've thought a lot about what I want to talk about today and again on Thursday for my Hi There program. And rather than getting into any in-depth political conversations, what I'd like to look at is African American and Jewish relations, dating back to when this country was founded, and to talk about what has happened in those relationships over the years, for both the good and the not so good. Because our relationship with African Americans has been our Jewish relationship, or our relationship as Jews with African Americans, has been incredibly varied, from wonderful relationships, supportive, to extremely contentious. And much depends upon what was going on at any given point in time in the history of our country. So I'm going to do this with you as a way for educating all of us about the Jewish African American history of our country, and not to make any judgments, any statements of opinion, or any political platforms, but simply to bring you the history, the facts. And these are documented facts based upon the writings of many esteemed authors whom I will attribute as I go through this information. And as I said, we have a very complicated and challenging history between blacks and Jews in the United States of America. What I hope to do on Thursday is to finish up some of this history, and then to read you statements that have come from the Reform movement and the conservative movement about what is going on in our country right now and where those two Jewish religious movements stand. Now, a lot can happen between now and Thursday, and there may actually be additional statements that come out from other movements, possibly from the Reconstructionist movement, from the Orthodox movement, and so on. And out of fairness and equity, I will include anything that I'm able to get between now and Thursday, which is why I'm waiting until Thursday to see if other statements come out from other Jewish religious denominations. So let's start by talking about American Jewish and African American relations over many, many decades, and certainly over several centuries of U.S. history. To begin with, African Americans and Jewish Americans have interacted really throughout much of the history of the United States. And that relationship included very widely publicized cooperation and conflict since the 1970s, and it's been an area of significant academic research. There are people who have based their entire academic careers on the research of Black-Jewish relations in the United States. Cooperation during the Civil Rights Movement was one of the strategic and significant culminating events that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the relationship has also had conflict and controversy related to things such as the Black Power movement, Zionism, affirmative action, and anti-Semitic sentiment against the alleged role of American and Caribbean-based Jews in the Atlantic slave trade, which I'll talk about later. During the colonial era, Jewish immigrants to British America were generally merchants who came from London, although there is a history of Jews coming to the United States as much as over 350 years ago through the Dutch West Indies Trading Company. Most of them settled in cities like Providence, Rhode Island, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and generally they became a part of the local societies. They were slaveholders that were in places where that was the local practice, and Jews were involved, but according to Professor Ellie Barber, to an insignificant degree. Now, that doesn't absolve them of the guilt of having been slaveholders. But everyone at that time made money off of American slaves, and it was Arabs and Europeans and Africans and Jews alike. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, so we're talking about the late 1800s and the early 1900s, millions of Ashkenazi Jews from Germany and Eastern Europe immigrated to the United States, and it was for social and economic opportunities and due to the widespread pogroms that were taking place in their homelands of Eastern Europe, Germany, and so on. And mainly these millions of Ashkenazi Jews settled in the Northeast and the Midwest. So they came to Cleveland and Detroit and Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, Chicago, and so on. And Jewish immigrants entered northeastern and midwestern cities during the same period of time when blacks were migrating in the hundreds of thousands from the rural South in what was known as the Great Migration, also to many of these cities. So Jews and blacks had early on in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, had a greater variety of encounters simply because they were peoples who were migrating at about the same time. And they were, they were having similar experiences, but those experiences in these urban northern centers like New York, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland were very, very different from the experience that were taking place amongst Jews and blacks in these agricultural southern parts of the United States. In the early 1900s, Jewish newspapers drew parallels between the black movement that was out of the South and the Jews' escape from Egypt, pointing out that both blacks and Jews had lived in ghettos and calling anti-black riots in the South pogroms. So Jews actually published in their own newspapers articles about pogroms that were happening in the South. And they stressed the similarities rather than the differences between the Jewish and the black experience. And American Jewish leaders emphasized the idea that both groups would benefit the more America moved towards a society of merit and free of religious and ethnic and racial restrictions. So this had been going on since the early start of the 20th century. Organizations like the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League were really central to this campaign against racial prejudice. And Jews made substantial financial contributions to many civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the Urban League and the Conference, or the Congress rather, of Racial Equality, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And about 50% of the civil rights attorneys in the South during the 1960s were Jews, as over 50% of the whites who went to Mississippi in 1964 to challenge the Jim Crow laws were white. And so we see a tremendous involvement by white Jews during the 50s and 60s in the civil rights movement. And I think that is not a fact that is lost on any of you. I know when I moved to St. Petersburg, Florida, I had a resident who had lived in St. Pete for many, many years, for 50 plus years. And he remembers the bridge coming over Tampa Bay from Tampa into St. Petersburg and the signs on those bridges that said, "No dogs, no blacks, no Jews allowed." And so there was an affinity between Jews and blacks based upon a shared history of slavery, a shared history of anti-Semitism and anti-black sentiment, and it made a lot of sense that this actually existed between the two communities. So there was a early promoter of African redemption by the name of Marcus Garvey, who lived between 1887 and 1940, and he led the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League. And his push was to celebrate Africa as the original homeland of African Americans. And that led many Jews to compare Garvey to the leaders of Zionism. He wanted World War I peace negotiators actually to turn over former German colonies in Southwest Africa to blacks. And he stressed self-determination for these former colonies. Zionists at the same time were promoting a return of Jews after 2,000 years to their own historic homeland of Israel. So unfortunately, Garvey also regularly criticized Jews in his columns in his newspaper, which was called Negro World, as saying that they were allegedly trying to destroy the black population of America. So there were prominent African Americans during the early decades of the 20th century who were not promoters of a more civil conversation between blacks and Jews. And then in 1915 in Georgia, there was a much publicized lynching of Leo Frank, who was a Jew, by a mob of Southerners, and that caused many Jews to become acutely conscious of the similarities and differences between themselves and blacks. You may remember this case. There was a young girl by the name of Mary Fagan, who was called Little Mary Fagan, who had been there was an accusation that Frank had murdered her. And Frank's defense attorney suggested that it was actually a janitor by the name of Jim Corley, who was guilty of the murder of the white girl. And unfortunately, those attorneys of Leo Franks called him a dirty, filthy, black, drunken, lying N-word. And in more recent years, it has been concluded that Jim Conley did indeed murder Mary Fagan, but there was a group of Southerners who lynched Leo Frank for this murder. So we see already in the early decades of the 20th century some of these conflicts between Southerners and Jews, and certainly between blacks and Jews, already beginning to take hold. But in the early 20th century, Jewish daily and weekly publications frequently reported on this violence against blacks, and often compared the anti-black violence that they saw in the South to the pogroms that had been enacted against the Jews and endured by the Jews by the Russian Empire. And they were inspired by principles of justice, and many Jews had a desire to change these racist policies in the United States, because they saw themselves as having been victims of a similar destiny when they lived in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And they supported civil rights movements through philanthropy, social service, and organizing. And in fact, Jews were among the largest contributors to these civil rights organizations. They made sure that their actions were well publicized as a way of not only showing what they were doing for the Black rights movement, but also to unfortunately ingratiate themselves in the political climate and to increase their own political clout. So this is some of the earlier history. We read about Julius Rosenwald, who was a Jewish philanthropist who donated a huge part of his own fortune to supporting education of blacks in the South by providing matching funds and constructing the Rosenwald schools in rural areas. And Jews played a major role in the NAACP in the early decades, very involved in the NAACP. And Jewish names such as Joel Elias Spingarn, Arthur B. Spingarn, Henry Moskowitz, and more recently Jack Greenberg were all leaders in this organization. So following the Civil War, we're backtracking a few decades now. Following the Civil War, there was a very good working relationship between Jewish shop owners and landlords who were engaged in business with black customers and tenants, because these Jewish shopkeepers often filled a void where white business owners would not venture. And I can speak a little bit to that experience because when I was a student at Hebrew Union College, myself and my classmates served many underserved Jewish congregations in rural areas, many of them in the South, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and other areas where the Jewish populations had declined to really just a handful of Jews. And I served several pulpits, but the two that stand out most prominently in my mind were in Williamson, West Virginia, where I served as the High Holy Day rabbi one year, and the other was in Seminole, Oklahoma, where it was the most wonderful, welcoming community, tiny, tiny little Jewish community. But going through these towns in Williamson, West Virginia, which is right across the Ohio River from Kentucky, right in the heart of coal country, and also in Seminole, Oklahoma, which was the heart of oil country. You see remnants of the Jewish community and their impact on these rural towns. And you see old stores that said Goodman Dry Goods and Cohen Pharmacy and things of that nature. So these remnants of the impact of the Jewish community still remain in some of these southern rural towns where there are tiny Jewish populations. And as far as I know, many of the students from Hebrew Union College, the Reformed Seminary, still serve some of these small rural Jewish communities, not only for the High Holy Days, but all year long. They may go in once a month or twice a month to do services and so on. Many white business owners, other than white Jewish business owners, would not serve the Jewish populations in these rural southern towns. So the white shop owners were very often merchants in these small cities who had come from urban areas like New York, and they settled in these rural towns, and they tended to be more civil to the black customers, treating them with more dignity than the white shop owners. And blacks often had more immediate contact with Jews than they did with other whites. But it wasn't always that way. And there were those, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a black historian who early in the 20th century in 1903 interpreted the rule of the blacks or the Jews in the South as successors to the slave barons, and said that, essentially when the slave barons left, the Jews became heir to that part of the economy. And so, there are tales of projects for money getting and improvement companies that came in that really were based on improving the economic livelihoods of the Jews in these towns. And a lot of the industry that had started in some of these small rural southern towns, when and if they failed, were taken over by Jews. So novelist James Baldwin, who lived from 1924 to 1987, wrote, who grew up in Harlem in those years between the world wars, he wrote, "In Harlem, our landlords were Jews and we hated them. We hated them because they were terrible landlords and did not take care of the buildings. The grocery store owner was a Jew. The butcher was a Jew, and yes, we certainly paid more for bad cuts of meat than other New York citizens. And we often carried insults home along with our meats. And the pawnbroker was a Jew. Perhaps we hated him most of all." But Baldwin also wrote other accounts of Jews that were more sympathetic. So you could see that this was this was a relationship fraught with love and hate between the Jews and the blacks in the early decades of the 20th century. And Baldwin also wrote, "The first white man I ever saw was the Jewish manager who arrived to collect the rent, and he collected the rent because he did not own the building. I never in fact saw any of the people who owned any of the buildings in which we scrubbed and sufficed for so long, until I was a grown man and famous." So James Baldwin writes about the fact that the Jews came to collect the rent, but they didn't own the buildings. So they were sent to do the dirty work. They were the tenant landlords that were sent to do the dirty work for the owners of the buildings. And he says that none of them were Jews, and I was not stupid. The grocer and the druggist were Jews, for example, and they were very, very nice to me and to us. I knew a murderer when I saw one, and the people who were trying to kill me were not the Jews. So, even in his comments about um, being made to feel lesser than, he also applauds the Jews because he knows that they were really not the ones who were out to get him. Martin Luther King suggested that some black anti-Semitism arose because of these tensions of this landlord-tenant relationship. And he said, when we were working in Chicago, we had numerous rent strikes on the West Side, and it was unfortunately true that in most instances, the persons we had to conduct these strikes against were the Jewish landlords. But again, these landlords were not necessarily the owners of the buildings. The Negro ends up paying a color tax, and this has happened in instances where Negroes actually confronted Jews as the landlord or the storekeeper. The irrational statements that have been made are the result of those confrontations. So what we have here is we see the beginning of relationships that are fraught with confrontation, but also with understanding. With Jews who were put in positions of quasi power, but only because the white owners of the buildings didn't want to do the dirty work. And it's not unsimilar to what we saw with Jews who were, for centuries, allowed to be moneylenders because the Bible said that you were not allowed to lend money and charge interest. And so other occupations were not permitted to Jews for centuries. They could not be members of guilds, so they could not be blacksmiths and goldsmiths and silversmiths. They could not own land, so they couldn't be farmers and so on. So there were very few occupations that were left to Jews, one of which, unfortunately, was money lending. And so William Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice, the character of Shylock was, the story may not be real, but certainly the personage of a Jewish moneylender was real. So I'm going to stop there for today. And again, my purpose in these sessions for the next few days is not to make judgments or become political, but simply to review the long, sometimes great and sometimes very difficult history of blacks and Jews in the United States. And on Thursday for Chai there, I'm going to be talking about blacks and Jews in the entertainment industry, and then we're going to talk about the civil rights movement and how the civil rights movement of the late 50s and the 60s in many ways cemented the relationship of Jews and blacks in the United States, but also we began to see some of the fissures and the fractures. And some of those fissures and fractures, which have really not been repaired until more recently, but also against the background of a vocal anti-Semitic movement among Black Americans. So it's a very contentious, a very difficult, and a very complex relationship, which we'll talk about more on Thursday. I invite you to email me. I invite you to call me. I would love to hear your feedback on this subject. I ask all of you to stay safe. I ask all of you to stay in the buildings. This is not the time to go get manicures. This is not the time to go get your haircut. I'm concerned that because of what we're seeing in our major cities, that there might be an upsurge of the coronavirus. people not distancing and people not wearing masks, and this is not the time for you to start going out into the community. So those of you with cars, please stay put. Those of you with family, I know you want to see your family. I'm dying to see my family. Haven't seen them either for many months. And I hope that you will be cognizant of your fellow residents, of all of those at Seacrest who are trying with all their might to take care of you and to keep you healthy. And I'm going to wish you a lehitraot. Please stay safe, please stay healthy, and I'll see you for Chai there on Thursday morning. Bye-bye.